When Mr. Brooms invited me to speak here this afternoon, I told him that I had not addressed a speech day since I left the Ministry of Education in August 2001. And it was with good cause and reason. I felt then, and for many years after, that it was important for others to be able to develop their own persona, their own policy framework, and that one of the worst things that could happen was to have someone who had spent as long as I had spent in the ministry, namely 7 years, seeking to pontificate on issues in relation to the educational sector. I think that you and I will both agree that while I do not intend to dwell on policy for long this afternoon, that 13 years is more than a sufficiently long period of time that will enable me now to share just a few perspectives before I go on to what I consider to be the thrust of what I want to say here, and that is to the children. And perhaps it is my greatest regret, Mr. Brooms and members of the board, that this hall is not bigger, because I really do believe that speech days are for the children first and foremost. Not just for those who win prizes, but for all children, because it inspires those who may not yet have made the mark to want to achieve the next year. Indeed, those who worked with me in the Ministry of Education knew my strong views on this matter. And very often I would say that we did not need attendance by a lot of education officers leave the seats for the children, because they were the ones who would benefit the most. I can see that that is not a challenge here this evening, and Mr. Brown carries the flag strongly on behalf of the ministry. But on reflection, and Mr. Brooms reflected on the educational sector enhancement program, EduTech. And I think that it is important for me to refocus what persons ought to have understood was the main thrust, and to recognize that educational reform does not happen overnight, but it takes a generation. And it takes a generation of continuous application, because the fundamental reason why EduTech was undertaken was not to introduce technology in schools. That was one of the things that we did in order to aid in the assistance of what we were trying to achieve. But the fundamental reason why EduTech was introduced was to change what we learn and to change how we learn. And it is on those two objectives that I believe that there is still work to be done. And the work that is to be done largely coincides, ironically, with the theme of this speech day. Because when we change how we teach as teachers, and when we change what we teach as teachers, it is intended not to have a student leave school with the greatest amount of knowledge in their head, but it is intended to allow students to be able to think critically and creatively. We understood when we introduced the Education White Paper back in 1995 that no one could plot out the challenges of the world in which we live. We didn't expect in 1995 that you would have a 9/11 and that the world would change fundamentally in terms of what it valued, how it valued things, and who it sought to profile and who it sought to create room for. We didn't expect that there would be the tsunami that literally wiped out tens of thousands of people in Southeast Asia, bringing to us in our own islands a truer appreciation of what could be possible in a world where climate change is negatively affecting our ability to live on these shores. We didn't expect many of the things that have come to characterize our countries in the region, and in particular our island here. And it is for that reason that it was more important for the children leaving our schools to be able to think for themselves, to think creatively, to think critically. And in so doing, they would be anchored to be able to face any set of circumstances that their community, their family, their country, their region, their world would present to them. But it wasn't sufficient for them to think creatively and critically. There was also the requirement that they understood the need for self-rooting and strong self-esteem and confidence. I have often said that the words of Bob Marley in that greatest of songs of his, Redemption Song, taken from the great Marcus Messiah Garvey, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. That would be the mission of those of us who were born around the independence movement and who would come of age as we moved into the second generation of independence. Those who accepted the mantle of bringing us to independence had the very real task of dealing with the difficulties that ordinary people experience just to be able to keep their soul together in relation to housing, in relation to basic amenities, in relation to a basic living. Country where some of the greatest threats to the stability of the country and indeed to government's growing expenditure comes not only from external circumstances, but comes from individual choices made by individual citizens in relation to the kind of life that they choose to lead. Whether it is in reckless behavior in terms of healthy habits not being pursued and practiced. And we hear all the time now about the consequences of what level of expenditure the country must incur as a result of the virtual epidemic proportions of chronic non-communicable diseases, or to put it in plain English, diabetes and heart condition and all of the other stroke and all of the other things that are just taking too many Bajans down in the prime of their life. When you start to watch how people eat, I was guilty of it at one time. And when you begin to understand that we are what we eat, and this is why I say that speech days are for talking to children too, not just to speak to policy. But when you as kids, you have the luxury now of eating any and everything. Although less and less, because there are too many youngsters at late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s developing type 2 diabetes in this country. When you start to also realize that how you live your life in terms of putting yourself at risk, there are too many young people who become the victims of violence in this country and who need not become the victims of violence. And this country has been good to us because it has invested heavily in creating opportunities for each and every child of both hitherto a Barbadian or a Barbadian resident. And we have to ask ourselves whether we are prepared to abandon those things that we did to keep us safe on 166 square miles. When we discussed up to 5 years ago What were the causes of poverty still in Barbados? For the most part, poverty arose not because of lack of economic opportunity in terms of access to education, access to loans, access to healthcare. Poverty arose as a result of the hardcore of social ills that may cause people's behavior to be skewed one way or the other. All forms of abuse, mental, physical, verbal. Opportunities that may result as a result of a person being physically or mentally differently able. Opportunities where sometimes pure worthlessness on the part of a parent not to take care and rear their children in a way that they know they ought to be reared given the opportunities that were available to them publicly. But for the first time in the last year, we have started to doubt ourselves as a people and to begin to believe that the things which your parents and which you as parents believe to be important to lift you from the circumstances of poverty in this country, because all of us are within 2 generations of poverty to 3 generations of poverty in this country, barring a handful. And don't fool yourself about that. Canon Isaacs may be able to better speak to these issues than me. But we begin to doubt ourselves as to what we must do. And all of a sudden, the things that should be protected the most become the first things and the easiest things to give away. I sat here this afternoon, not feeling the best, and I watched proud children, one by one, by one, by one, by one, go up on this platform, achieving within their school such that recognition was inevitable for them today. And I asked myself, how many of these children in 2, 5, 7 years will be given the opportunity that those who went here like Ian Carrington, that those who went here like Alvin Quinton, like Dorsey Boyce, like Rodney, how many of them will get the same opportunities that previous Parkinson graduates got from 1961 to 2013? How many? And when we add to that the bald reality that we are as good as we are healthy, when we add to that, and I want to commend this school for not only relying upon the school meals for a lunch program, but for the breakfast program which I heard about during the principal's speech. Because there is a Barbadian DNA. There is a Barbadian way. And the Barbadian way says a few things that all of us can relate to. We were taught, educate the children. You had 200 primary schools in the year 1900. 114 years ago, this country on 166 square miles had 200 primary schools teaching people the 7th standard. Some may argue a 7th standard better than many a secondary education for some. We had 6 secondary schools, and education was the watchword. We were told, own a piece of the rock. So much so that Barbados developed at law a process called foreclosure suits, title suits, which allowed people, when the parents or the family told them, look, that piece there is yours, and it was passed on, as we would call it, seed to seed. They never got any paper very often. But we developed a mechanism for that person to go to court and to get title for that land, such that if they needed to go and borrow money, to fix the house, or for health reasons, or for education, or for sending somebody overseas, they could go and do it. That was the Barbadian way. We believed in supporting those most incapable of supporting themselves, the weakest among us. Some may call it a strong sense of social justice. Some may call it the Kadir mentality. Kadir, give them a chance. How often have we heard people in our community, in our families, in our workplaces, make a case for others whom elsewhere they might ignore? But that is not the Barbadian way. And what we have started to cut are the very things that make us Barbadian.